Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. I'm Elana Stein Hain, and this is where we conceptualize a halakha concept that comes up in the daf. And what we are going to be talking about today is we're talking about the prohibition of asking a non-Jew to do something for you that you yourself are not permitted to do halachically. Now, we call that Amir la'akum or Amir Le-Nokhri. And generally speaking, when we talk about it with regards to Shabbos, not being allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform a malacha for you on Shabbos, that you yourself, because it's a malacha, are not allowed to do. We generally say Amira Le-Nokhri shvut or Amira la'akum shvut. There is a rabbinic prohibition to ask a non-Jew, tell a non-Jew to do a malacha on your behalf. And so the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Daf Tzadi Amud Aleph, in context of talking about not Shabbos, but just talking about the lav, the lotas, say the negative commandment of lotachsom shor b'disho, that you are not permitted to muzzle an animal that is working with food for you. The Gemara says, Yomar Adam Le-Nokhri chasom barati v'doshba. Can you ask a non-Jew to muzzle your animal and do the work with the animal, right? Make the animal thresh. And that way you get around lotachsom shor b'disho. And the Gemara says, what we're really asking is, mi amrinan, do we say that ki amrinan Amira Le-Nokhri shvut, when we say that there is a rabbinic prohibition to ask a non-Jew to do something for you that you're not allowed to do yourself, maybe hanimili le'inyan Shabbat, maybe that only applies to Shabbos, de iser skila, because that is a really hefty violating Shabbos. At least if we're talking about a biblical violation of Shabbos, it's very hefty. Stoning is the penalty for it, which is pretty serious, at least if we're talking about, you have two witnesses and warning, etc. Aval chasima, but when it comes to muzzling an animal, the iser lav, which is just a lotas, say, just in quotes, low, maybe we don't have the issue of Amir Le-Nokhri being a problem. Odil maloshna, or maybe there's no difference. So there's no difference between whether we're talking about Shabbos or we're talking about a lotase. Now, I'm not really going to get into tonight, the question of sort of how we ultimately answer this question of, does this only apply to Shabbos or does this apply to other things as well? What I actually really want to do is I want to dig into the logic behind Amira Le-Nokhri shvut in the first place. I want to dig into the logic of, why do we say, even on Shabbos, why do we say that a Jew is not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do malacha for them, that because they themselves are not allowed to do it, right? And I'm adding the because, but we'll see what the because is. And I want to offer 4 different reasonings behind it. And I think for each of those 4 reasonings, I think it's useful to ask ourselves, okay, if this would be the reason, if this would be the logic behind Amira la'akum being a problem, then should it apply beyond Shabbos or shouldn't it apply beyond Shabbos, right? I'm not saying that it is always necessarily going to line up, but because I like to take a conceptual approach, I actually want to think about the reasoning behind it, the logic behind it, in order to try to answer the question of whether it should apply elsewhere, okay? So I'm going to give you 4 different approaches. The first approach actually baffles people because it is found in a Mechilta. In the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, I'm going to open up the sources. In the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, on the following pasuk, and it baffles people because, as you heard me say, Amir la'akum shvut or Amir Le-Nokhri shvut, there is an Isser Derabanan to ask a non-Jew to do something for you. And it's strange that the Mechilta actually is going to base it on a pasuk, which makes it sound like it's an Isser Deoraita, right? Which is very much the minority opinion among Rishonim and Poskim, etc. But it's Shmot Yud Bet pasuk Tet Zayin, talking about Pesach. Uvayom Rishon Mikra Kodesh, Uvayom Shvi'i Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. So on the first day, you're going to have a yantif. And on the 7th day, you're going to have a yantif. Kol melacha lo ye'aseh vahem. no work shall be done on them, meaning on that day 1 and on that day 7. Notice the passive voice. It doesn't say you shall do no work. It says no work shall be done. And then, of course, we have the famous big exception, which is the Yom Tov exception, except when it comes to making food for the day, right? But otherwise, all melacha shall not be done. And the Mechilta looks at that and says, noticing the passive voice. So we're in Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, and it says, and just I always like to mention these little things, Toch Kedei, on the Mechilta, we have 2 versions of Midrash Halakha, right? We have the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, which we say comes from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, and we have Mechilta de Rashbi, or Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which we generally say comes from the school of Rabbi Akiva, which for people who are interested in the way that Chazal develop, the distinction between the schools of Rabbi Ishmael and the schools of Rabbi Akiva in terms of how they think, whether it's exegetically, or meaning the way they read psukim, or theologically even, or halachically, is actually the subject of a lot of interesting writing that's out there in the world, a lot of interesting scholarship on that. But either way, we're in Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, okay? Kol melacha lo yasevahem. Here's the clause. No work shall be done, passive voice on them, on these yamim tovim. Lo ta'aseh ata, you shall not do. V'lo yaseh chavercha, and your friend, meaning your fellow Jew, shall not do. V'lo yaseh goy, nor shall a Gentile do melachtecha, your work. Okay, so this passive voice, all inclusive. Interesting that it's coming up on Yom Tov rather than coming up on Shabbos. But here's the limud, and then it gets a little complicated, but we're going to read it anyway because I think it's worth it. Atao Merkain, is that really the case? Oh, eno ella, or maybe it's only saying lo ta'aseh ata v'lo yaseh chavercha, that maybe you and your fellow Jew are not allowed to do this malacha, but maybe v'yaseh goy melachtecha, maybe a non-Jew specifically can do your melacha. Talmud Lomar, therefore, and this is where I think it's sticky because it's not so easy to understand how they're about to prove it. Say, therefore, we have a pasuk in Shemot Lamed Hey, pasuk Bet, Sheish yamim te'aseh melacha, for 6 days melacha shall be done. Interesting that it has the passive voice also. Uvayom hashvi'i yelachem kodesh, and on the 7th day shall be a separate day for you, meaning it shall be a consecrated day. Shabbat Shabbaton laHashem, it'll be a rest of rests, in honor of God. Kol haoseh vo melacha yumat, anybody who does melacha there will die on that day. Now, maybe that pasuk right there, both in the fact that it says on the 7th day, yelachem kodesh, it will be for you, plural, it will be holy. Maybe that indicates you and your friend, right? And also, kol haoseh bo melacha yumat, anyone, presumably a Jew, anyone who does melacha will die. The Mechilta continues to say, or indicates that maybe there you already know from there, and this is how I'm reading it, different people read it different ways, but maybe you already know from there that you and your friend are not allowed to do it, meaning you and a fellow Jew. And then halamadata, you learn from kol melacha lo yasevahem, this pasuk in Shemot Yud Bet that we started with, that no melacha may be done on them. That maybe adds halo ta'aseh ata. Certainly, we already know you can't do it. V'lo yaseh chavercha, nor can your fellow Jew do it. But maybe it also adds v'lo yaseh goy melachtecha. Even a non-Jew may not do this for you. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. That's what Rabbi Yoshia says. Again, it's not super clear, and there are different ways of explaining. The Malbim has his explanation of what this means. Other people have their explanation of what this means. But the way that I'm reading this essentially is that the pasuk that talks about Shabbos in Shemot Lamed Hey makes it very clear that anybody, meaning any Jew, who does malacha, whether it's a malacha for themselves or a malacha for another Jew, has violated Shabbos fully. And this new clause, I mean, obviously it comes earlier in the Torah, but this additional clause regarding Yom Tov, which we're assuming applies to Shabbos also, of no work shall be done on them, comes to include even a non-Jew doing your malacha. Now, people are very confused by this because they say, what are we even saying here? Why are you finding a pasuk for this? You don't need a pasuk for this. We said it's shvut. If you look in the Gemara, you find out that it's shvut. Well, first of all, I just want to say it's really interesting to consider that maybe not everybody early on within Chazal thought it was only shvut. Maybe early on within Chazal, some people thought that it was actually a problem in HaTorah. I would also add, it doesn't even say anything about Amira here. It doesn't say anything about the problem of you speaking to someone and telling them to do it. It even sounds like it's almost like they shouldn't do something of yours, whether you told them to or not, right? Which is interesting to consider just in terms of the evolution of Chazal's thought. But either way, when I think about the logic that this seems to be indicating, that the place where we get, whether it is literally the origin of the Isser, of the prohibition of asking a non-Jew to do something for you on Shabbos that you're not allowed to do, or it's just an asmachta, it's just a way of sort of connecting to a pasuk. That's not really the origin of it, but we connect to the pasuk in order to express some logic or some kind of spirit of the Torah that it is connected to. It seems to me that the logic here is really fascinating. I see this almost as Shabbos has a relationship to the Jewish people to such an extent that no Jews' melacha should be done on Shabbos. It doesn't even matter who does it. It's not just about the Jew keeping Shabbos. Shabbos is so immersive that it really includes even our stuff, even our labor, right? And our labor should not be done even by someone else. And to me, that's actually kind of a beautiful way of looking at Shabbos, because it's like an immersive, our whole world is immersed in Shabbos, right? It's not just even that we're immersed in Shabbos, our entire world is immersed in Shabbos. And there's something very, very magnificent about that, in my opinion. So let's take that as sort of one conceptual approach that we can have to the Isser of Amira La'akum, or even if we want to be more specific, here the Isser of just a non-Jew doing labor for a Jew, whether the Jew asked them to or not. I want to move on to a second version of the logic. And I think the second version of the logic is very different, the second approach. And, it's in no particular order, except for the fact that I wanted to start with the Mechilta because I wanted to look at that pasuk originally. But moving on to a second logical perspective here, we have a Gemara in Shabbos where there's a Mishnah that says, if somebody is traveling on a Friday and it gets dark out, noten kisolagoi, they can give their money pouch to a Gentile who they're walking with, who's going to continue to carry it for them on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, why is it okay to do that? And Rashi's explanation of the Gemara's question of why is it okay to do that is actually offering its own logic behind why it shouldn't be okay to do that, right? Meaning the Gemara asks why is it okay to do that, to give a non-Jew your money pouch to carry for you on Shabbos, because there must be something wrong with it, right? There must be something halakhically wrong with it. And Rashi there says, what's the problem? The non-Jew, after all, is your shaliach or your shlicha. The non-Jew is your emissary, right? And then the Gemara answers and explains why they would allow it nonetheless. But Rashi's logic here is maybe Amira La'akum is a problem because the Jew is essentially making the non-Jew their shaliach. And we know, and I'm not going to be super linear because there are all these questions about the possibility of a non-Jew serving as a shaliach or a shlicha, but ideationally, let's go with conceptually, right? Essentially, what we would say is shlucho shel adam kamoto, shlucha shel adam kamota, right? A person, their shaliach is like themselves. And the reason why Amira La'akum is a problem is not because, and these things don't have to be mutually exclusive, but I'm trying to actually put them in our heads in distinct places. It's not because Shabbos is so holistic that it has to include, even our stuff and even our labor. It's actually because if you ask a non-Jew to do it, it's as though the non-Jew is your shaliach. It's as though you did it. That's the problem. It's as though you did it, right? Very, very different logical frameworks for this. So that's a second. And after we do all four, we'll think about what should apply to other mitzvot or other tchumim, other arenas of Jewish law. Okay. Then we have the logic of the Rambam. Logic of the Rambam, it's not everything is so immersive. It's not, it's as though you did it. The logic of the Rambam is, do you really think that people are just going to go around asking non-Jews to do things for them on Shabbos, and they're still going to think about Shabbos in the same weighty, sanctified way? No way. Come on. Our behavior leads to different ways of thinking and feeling and experiencing things. So the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Shabbos, Perek Vav Halakha Aleph, he says, Asur lomar le-Nokhri lasot lanu melacha b'Shabbat. It is prohibited to tell a non-Jew, to ask a non-Jew to do labor for us on Shabbos, meaning something that is prohibited on Shabbos, not just labor, right? I'm calling it labor as like a category of what's usher on Shabbos. Even though a non-Jew doesn't have the mitzvah of Shabbos, they're not commanded to keep Shabbos. Even if you told them Shabbos that you wanted them to do it. And even if you only need that, the result of that performed action after Shabbos, right? Meaning, even if you could figure out a way to divorce it from Shabbos in some way, you tell them beforehand, you don't need it until afterwards. Nonetheless, asur. This is rabbinically, and the whole conversation about what Rambam means about midivrei sofrim. I literally have a book on my shelf that has 12 different approaches of what the Rambam means when he says midivrei sofrim. We're not doing that now, right? It says, but this is rabbinically prohibited, kidei shelo tiyeh Shabbat kala b'eineihem, so that Shabbos won't become light, as in not weighty, in their eyes. And you know what happens when Shabbos becomes light in someone's eyes? V'yavohu la'asot ba'atzma. A person will end up doing these melachot themselves, right? This, in some ways, Amira, it's a siyag, it's a fence. It's a fence around the Torah. We don't want people to start thinking of Shabbos in a permissive kind of way. We want to maintain the sanctity. We want to maintain that sense of reverence, that sense of, almost like distance in some way from what is allowed in order to keep, to keep people from transgressing, right? So that is a third. Here's a fourth, and I think this is a really fun one. And in some ways, when the Rambam says, even if you ask the non-Jew before Shabbos to do it, in some ways he's kind of alluding perhaps to this fourth reason that some give for the problem of Amira. And it comes from a pasuk, or it's an explanation of, or an application of, a pasuk in Yeshayahu, Nun Chet, Im tashiv mishabat raglecha, if you can hold your feet back from trampling Shabbos, asot chafatzecha b'yom kodshi, doing what your needs on my holy day, says God. V'karata l'Shabbos oneg, if you can call Shabbos a day of delight, likdosh Hashem mechubad, Hashem's holy day, if you can call it honored, right? This is where we get oneg Shabbos and kavod Shabbos, right? Oneg Shabbos being the things that you do to enjoy Shabbos, the eating, the drinking, etc. And kavod Shabbos being the things that you do in order to welcome Shabbos in a reverential way, lighting candles, putting on special clothes, right? It's right from this pasuk. And you can honor it by not just going on your usual ways. Not looking to your affairs, meaning not looking into your business. Vidaber davar, and not literally and not speaking words. Now, the way that scholars explain, it means you shouldn't be like bargaining on Shabbos, but Chazal in the Gemara and Shabbos say, wait a second, each one of these things, me'asot rachecha, mimtzo chefzecha, daber davar, each of these things we're actually going to relate to a certain way of acting on Shabbos that may not be something that we would have considered. We don't consider a malacha, but it is still something that you may not do on Shabbos. And so the Gemara says, but daber davar really means shelo yehei diburcha shel Shabbat kediburcha shel chol. Your speech on Shabbos should not be the same as your speech on chol. And this is where the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Shin Zayin goes with it. You're literally the daber davar, the last clause in that pasuk that we just read. Shelo yehei diburcha shel Shabbat kediburcha shel chol. Your speech on Shabbos shouldn't be like your speech during the week. Hilkach, therefore, asur lomar, it is prohibited to say, davar ploni es el machar. Tomorrow I'm doing X. O schora ploni tekne machar. Lemachar. Or tomorrow I'm buying Y. Ve'afilu b'sichat dvarim b'teilim asur lahar. And you're not even allowed to just talk idle chatter, too much idle chatter on Shabbos. And the Ramah adds, and I love this, the Ramah adds, uvnei adam, but people, shesipur shmot v'divrei chidushim, who own it, but people who love hearing news, right? They love hearing stories. They love hearing current events. They love hearing the latest news. And it's a delight for them. They're mutar l'sokram b'Shabbat. They're allowed to talk about that on Shabbos, kimo b'chol, like on a weekday. Aval misha eno mitaneg, but a person who doesn't get oneg from that, asur lo omram kidei shitaneg behem b'chavero. They can't start sharing news with their friend so that their friend will enjoy. But then the Shulchan Aruch moves on in the next seif to, guess what? V'daber davar, speaking a certain way on Shabbos, connects to the following. Asur liskor poalim. It is prohibited to hire workers. V'lo lomar la'akum liskor lo poalim b'Shabbat. And you may not tell a non-Jew, ask a non-Jew to hire workers for you on Shabbos. Af al pi she'ein ha'Yisrael tzarich lo'otam malacha ela lachar Shabbat. Even if you don't need the result of that work until after Shabbos, right? Shekol mashu asur lasoto b'Shabbat. Anything that a Jew is not allowed to do on Shabbos, asur lomar la'akum la'asoto, right? You may not tell a non-Jew to do. Afilu lomar lo kodem haShabbat la'asoto b'Shabbat asur. Now he adds, well, actually, you're not even allowed to say before Shabbos to tell them to do it. Aval mutar lo marlo achara Shabbat lama lo asita davar ploni b'Shabbat she'avar. But you are allowed after Shabbos to say, hey, how come this past Shabbos you didn't do X thing? Even though through that inference, a person will realize that you want them to do it the next week. But the point is, for the Shulchan Aruch, the speech act itself is actually the focus of this issue. We do not want people speaking about malacha on Shabbos. We don't want people telling people to do malacha for them on Shabbos. That is part of v'daber davar. Okay, so let's recap. What do we have? We have 4 logic models here. One, my take on the Mechilta, which is Shabbos is a time where all of Jewish life is supposed to be surrounded by Kedusha of Isser Malacha. There should not be any Malacha done that is for a Jew on Shabbos. That's the logic model that we have there. It is not just that a Jew shouldn't do, it's that a non-Jew shouldn't do for a Jew. Second, don't do Amira la'akum because you're turning the non-Jew into your shlicha, into your emissary. And it's as though you did it. Now, obviously, you didn't literally do it, but it's as though you did it. And therefore, we have an Isur d'Rabbanan. Third, don't do this because it's going to make you think lightly of Shabbos, and you'll come to violate Shabbos yourself. The Rambam, right? Eventually, What's the difference if they do it or if I do it? At the end of the day, the same thing gets done, right? Truth is, you just shouldn't be talking about Malacha on Shabbos. You should be talking differently. You shouldn't be telling people to do certain things for you on Shabbos. So I want to go logic model by logic model and see, do we think this should apply to other mitzvot? Because, by the way, another prominent place where Amira we talk about Amira is actually regarding Shemitah, which is kind of interesting because, of course, that's a Shabbos for the land and it's the 7th year. So there's something kind of beautiful and poetic about that. So let's say the logic is everything stops, right? Everything stops. Shabbos, our whole world is immersed. I could see saying that shouldn't apply really to Lo Tachsom Shor B'Disha. It's not an immersive, holiness in time. It's a different thing. I could see, by the way, why it would apply to Shemitah, the same logic as Shabbos, right? That our whole world is immersed in service of God in that time, right? So I don't know if I would apply it there. The second, because the person is your shaliach, I totally see that applying to Lo Tachsom Shor B'Disha. What does it matter if you're doing a weighty Isser Skila or you're doing a light, quote unquote, Isser Lav? You don't make a non-Jewish shaliach to do an Aveira for you. What's the difference? Right? Shaliach is a shaliach is a shaliach. Shlicha is a shlicha. Right? Let's say the logic model of you're going to come to think of it in a light way. And you're going to come to think of it in a light way and maybe come to violate it yourself. So here I could go two ways on the two directions on the Lo Tachsom Shor B'Disha. I could go two directions. On the one hand, I see how having to ask the non-Jew to do it for you when we're just quote unquote talking about a lo taseh, in some way is already reminding a person they can't do it themselves, right? But on the other hand, I also see, and this is sort of the cynicism that people have around loopholes, I also see that, when you really, with no kind of inconvenience whatsoever, right? And with no change in reality whatsoever, when you try to get the same outcome as you would have if you did the Aveira yourself, people do think about it as kind of a lighter, come on, is this really such an Isser? It's obviously not such an Isser. So I could see applying it to Lo Tachsom Shor B'Disha. And then at the end, talking about Daber Davar, of course, if Amir La'akum is about Daber Davar, that's something for Shabbos and Yom. That's not something that's for other things. But I do think, these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. They really, really, really don't. What I might say is that there's a little bit of poetic comparison that you could make between the first and the fourth logics, where it's malacha should not be done. Our malacha should not be done. And we shouldn't be speaking even about malacha on Shabbos. There's kind of something, the kind of holistic, complete, immersive elements that those two things share. And the two middle explanations of, well, you're making somebody your shaliach and it's as though you did it yourself, or you're going to come to think of Shabbos lightly and we're worried that you're going to do it yourself. I think those two also share something in common in terms of the Jew herself, the Jew themselves, Jews themselves not getting involved in one way or another with an Isser Malacha, whether it's a situation where they're making somebody their shaliach or it's a situation of we're worried that they might come to do it themselves. So it's a little bit like, are we thinking about Shabbos as this big holistic thing and that's sort of where we're headed, or are we working with, but maybe are we focused more on the psyche or the actions of individual Jews? You could parse it other ways as well, but I hope, to be honest, like if you listen to this before Shabbos, I hope it actually inspires you to think about your own relationship to Shabbos. So thanks for listening, everybody. Looking forward to next week.